So this is our last session, I'm sad to say. It's been a delight to be with you all in the Zoom room, spiritual formation room, over the last 4 weeks. And I do want to say that those of you who have been part of this 4-week session with the idea that you're either going to be confirmed or received into the Episcopal Church or make a reaffirmation of your baptismal vows, Jesse and Jeannie and I will be talking with you shortly. We're all going to have an opportunity to have a Zoom conversation because, as you can imagine, things are a little bit different. What with the fact that we're not all together and aren't quite sure when we're going to be all together yet. So we'll keep in conversation about that. But I'm delighted to have had the opportunity. And I've saved the best presentation for last because, as the official archivist for the Diocese of Ohio, this is where my heart lies in terms of taking a look at history, because, as I am wont to say, history is a prologue to the future. That's not an original thought with me. I borrowed it from one of my predecessors in the archives, but it's a really good idea and a really good premise on which to work. So our topic tonight is Bishop's Buildings and the Broad Work of the Church. And what I'm going to do is, you all are on mute, and I encourage you to stay on mute. Otherwise, there'll be a cacophony of noise, which isn't inappropriate given that we've got Pentecost coming up. But we're going to read together Psalm 16 for one particular verse, which will become very apparent when we get to it. Okay? So as our way of opening up, I invite you to join me in saying Psalm 16. Protect me, O God, for I take refuge in you. I have said to the Lord, you are my Lord, my good above all other. All my delight is upon the godly that are in the land, upon those who are noble among the people. But those who run after other gods shall have their troubles multiplied. Their libations of blood I will not offer, nor take the names of their gods upon my lips. O Lord, you are my portion and my cup. It is you who uphold my lot. My boundaries enclose a pleasant land. Indeed, I have a goodly heritage. I will bless the Lord who gives me counsel. My heart teaches me night after night. I have set the Lord always before me, because he is at my right hand, I shall not fail. My heart therefore is glad, and my spirit rejoices. My body also shall rest in hope. For you will not abandon me to the grave, nor let your Holy One see the pit. You will show me the path of light. In your presence there is fullness of joy, and in your right hand are pleasures forevermore. Well, as an archivist, I appreciate beyond measure the verse about us having a goodly heritage. And as Christians, as Episcopalians, as members of St. Paul's and the Diocese of Ohio, we have indeed a goodly heritage, and we're going to review that a little bit tonight. I always have to tip my hat to the Reverend Dr. George Franklin Smythe, who was for many years the historiographer of the Diocese of Ohio. And some of you have heard me say before that he was tasked by Bishop Leonard with writing a history of the diocese in time for the centenary celebration, which was 1918. He was given the task in 1915. He had a group of 6 men and 1 woman who was a part of the group to start that. The project, however, was delayed by a number of reasons, some of which we'll talk about in just a few minutes. But he finally did publish his history of the Diocese of Ohio from its beginnings to the year 1918, and it came out published in green hardback, and it came out in 1931 for $4 a volume. You could own one of these puppies. $4 was all it took. And it is sort of an incredible history of our diocese. It goes well back before 1816, which is where we're going to pick up tonight, because there were Episcopalians who came into the state of Ohio before 1816. But around 1815, 1816 or so, we had 4 clergy persons who were missionaries from other dioceses who came to see if there were any Episcopalians in the settlements around Ohio. And of those, we have Roger Cyril on the left, who along with his wife Sarah, and Philander Chase on the right, who along with his first wife Mary were among the pioneering priest families who came from the East to minister along with the people of Ohio. And I always like to mention Sarah and Mary because truly the women who were married to these men deserve more credit than they ever get in print. And although George Franklin Smythe does give them a little bit of due, I can't, for example, find any photographic or iconic images of these women. I have one of Roger Cyril, I have one of Philander Chase, but not of their spouses. I do have a photograph of Philander Chase's second wife, Sophia, and we'll talk about that again in a few minutes. Well, Philander Chase, who eventually would become our first bishop, arrived in Ohio in 1817 via Pittsburgh across the frozen Lake Erie by a horse-drawn sleigh. And he writes that as he was crossing the lake, that the ice was giving way beneath the runners and the water was running over the runners. But they persevered and they got to Ashtabula and into the state of Ohio he came. He was elected bishop in 1818, and I always like to tell people that Philander Chase was something of a formidable character. We know of from both his writings and from what other people have said of him. And basically, he met with an electing convention that included the 4 other clergy in Ohio, one of whom was not eligible to vote. And he more or less said to them, "You're going to elect me bishop." And although Roger Cyril probably should have been the first bishop of Ohio, everybody acquiesced, and Philander Chase became the first bishop. His consecration was put off by almost a year, primarily because there was some bad blood between him and the Bishop of New York, and it was reported that Chase owned slaves when he was the rector of Christ Church in New Orleans. That got all worked out, and finally in 1819, on February 2nd, he was consecrated the 18th bishop of the American Succession. Now, ask me later, please, because it's a story worth hearing about the falderall between Chase and actually owning a slave, and he did. He and Mary had a slave in New Orleans. It was the person that was basically their housekeeper, and I'll tell you the whole story in full at another time because it is worth hearing. So he arrives back in the state of Ohio 2 days after he's consecrated in 1819, and immediately forms a congregation in Windsor Mills, Ohio, which is named Christ Church. Windsor Mills, the church today, this is how it looks today. It is no longer an active Episcopal church. Sometime in the 1950s, the Diocese of Ohio handed this church over to the Historical Society of Windsor Mills. We open it once every year or two in order to be able to have a service there and keep it on the register of historical places. But it was one of the first congregations that Philander Chase organized. This is the consecration document for Philander Chase, which I have to share with you that I found in the scary basement of Trinity Cathedral in the Cathedral Archives room, which is next to the crypt under the altar. And it's a scary room because there's running water from the groundwater down the walls. So the boxes that are on the floor are completely sopping wet. I'm really delighted that this box was up far enough that the water didn't get it. And I also like to point out that, that in fact, John Henry Hobart, the Bishop of New York, with whom Chase had issues, was actually one of his co-consecrators. So that's kind of a cool thing. What I have for you on the right is a picture of Philander Chase's seal from his Episcopal ring. This is his seal from the time when he was the Bishop of Illinois. When he was the Bishop of Ohio, he did not have an Episcopal ring. And when he was made Bishop of Illinois in the 1830s, he did get a ring, and the ring has on it his personal mantra, which is Jehovah Jireh, which is a mistranslation of Scripture. Nonetheless, it's translated God will provide, and that was Chase firmly believed throughout all of his life, that wherever God was leading him, whatever ministry God was leading him and his wife and his family into, that God would provide for them, and God did. Philander Chase was one of the pioneering bishops of the Midwest. We have to remember that at the time he was made Bishop of Ohio, the diocese comprised the entire state. And so he would ride around to the settled areas on a big white horse named Cincinnatus, and he would have a bushel basket full of prayer books, and he would go into a settlement and he would find somebody that could read, usually the lawyer or the doctor in town, and he would make them the lay reader. And then he would say, here's a bushel basket of prayer books. You read morning prayer until I can send a priest around to celebrate communion with you. And that's how he sort of nurtured congregations all through the state. Now, he did this from his farm in Worthington, Ohio. As a bishop, he didn't have a salary. He had to earn his keep by farming. He also taught school. He was a school teacher in order to raise money to provide for his family. And he was having so much of a challenge trying to lure priests from the east to come and preach to the Bears and Indians of Ohio, that he decided he needed to raise up indigenous priests from Ohio. And so he decided that he needed to form and found a school in order to educate men for the priesthood at the time. And that is how we got Kenyon College in 1824. It was actually founded on his farm in Worthington, but he bought some land outside of Mount Vernon. And this is Philander Chase's sketch of the main building on the campus at Kenyon College as it was being built. It was called, the building is Old Kenyon. And this was the place where the students and the faculty lived and ate their meals and studied together for the first years of Kenyon College. I always like to tell the story that as this building was going up, the farmers in the area weren't quite sure what was going on, because in their minds, which was right after the War of 1812, or in terms of memory, institutional memory, they thought that perhaps the British were building a fort to start another war. Fortunately, they waited until the college was done and they realized that it was in fact a school. This is the very first building that Philander Chase consecrated for the specific purpose of being a church. Now, he was made the bishop in 1819, and this is St. James in Cross Creek, which he did not consecrate until 1826. Prior to that time, congregations met in schoolhouses, they met in hotel lobbies, they met in one case, they met in I can't ever remember the name, blacksmith shop. A congregation in the diocese met in a blacksmith shop. So this was a real source of joy that we finally had a building that was dedicated for as a house of worship. And then right after that, in the years following, Chase consecrated 4 more buildings in pretty quick succession. This is Trinity Church in Cleveland, which he consecrated in 1829. That was followed by St. Peter's in Ashtabula, which he also consecrated in the summer of 1829. This is St. Paul's Medina, which he also consecrated in 1829 as well. This is a song that was written, the text rather, was written by George Franklin Smythe, that tells the story about Philander Chase going across the seas to England to raise money so that he could build Kenyon College. And this is a college song which is still sung by incoming first-year students and graduating seniors to this day. It's a pretty it's a pretty cool song. The tune, for those of you who are interested in this kind of thing, it is called The Pope. And the first line of the original lyrics are, "The Pope, he leads a merry life." Well, in our case, it's "The first of Kenyon's goodly race." You can see this, there's the same meter that goes along with it. Here is Sophia Chase, along with her husband, Philander. I need to tell you that in 1831, in September, the Convention of the Diocese of Ohio demanded that Bishop Chase relinquish some control. He was what we would call a control freak. Not only was he the Bishop of Ohio and the president of Kenyon College, but he was also the postmaster of Gambier and the fire chief. So that just gives you a little bit of an idea about how tightly how tight the control was. And this frustrated both the clergy in the diocese and the faculty at Kenyon College. So they basically said, you can either be the president of Kenyon College or you can be the Bishop of Ohio, but you can't be both. And his response on September 10th was to say, if I can't be both, I'm not going to be either. And he loaded up his family and his belongings on a buckboard wagon and drove out of Gambier, never to return. He went to a place near Millersburg, which he named the Valley of Peace. And the next spring, he went to Gilead, Michigan. And then in 1835, he was elected first bishop of the Diocese of Illinois. He returned to England, he got more money, and he built another college out in Illinois, which was called Jubilee College. That is a college which is now defunct, and the land is Jubilee College State Park, and that is in fact where Philander and Sophia are buried. This photograph was taken in 1844, and the reason why it was snapped is because Chase by that time had become the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church. In the early years of the church, you became the presiding bishop by virtue of the death of the last bishop who had the most seniority. So on February 15th, 1843, the Right Reverend Alexander Viets Griswold, who was the 5th presiding bishop, died, and at that point, Philander Chase had the most seniority, and he became the presiding bishop. In October 1844, he presided over the 21st General Convention, which was meeting in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And at this convention, Philander and Sophia both had a portrait snapped, but they also had a portrait of themselves taken together. And I am really grateful that we have this iconic image of Philander and his wife. Enter into the picture. Hardly had Philander Chase left Gambier in 1831 when this man, Charles Pettit McIlvaine, was elected bishop. And he was an ardent evangelical. If you don't already know the birth story of St. Paul's, what you need to know is that it was born out of Bishop McIlvaine's reaction to and rejection of what was called ritualism. Now, we've talked about that a little bit before in our Episcopal 101 when we talked about the Oxford movement that went around the world between 1830 and 1850, mostly on college campuses, and was intended to be to get the church to appreciate the historic worship of the church. And this is a illustration from a book called Blasts from the Ram's Horn. And here you have a priest wafting an incense pot and a prayer book in two hands, and on one hand you have the Pope. On one side of the fence you have the Pope. On the other side of the fence you have an evangelical clergyman, and the caption is, "Will he go over?" In other words, which way is he going to fall? Well, Bishop McIlvaine was an ardent anti-ritualist, and he preached and wrote volumes of material on anti-ritualism. There is a apocryphal story, which certainly has a nugget of truth to it, that says when Bishop McIlvaine would go around to churches to do Episcopal visits, he would take his walking stick and he would go up and he would bang his walking stick on the legs of the communion table to make sure it was in fact a communion table and not a stone altar. And because he would have nothing to do with stone altars. That was all part of ritualism. So there was a little bit of consternation between Bishop McIlvaine and the rector of Trinity Church. Trinity Church in Cleveland, which eventually would become the cathedral, was one of a handful of congregations in the Diocese of Ohio that were leaning toward the Oxford movement, leaning toward the high church movement. And Bishop McIlvaine did not like that. So he went ahead and in 1842, he ordained a fellow by the name of Gideon Babcock Perry, who was a Baptist minister. He ordained him as a deacon. So what happened was Trinity Church was looking for a new rector at that time. And there's James Bolus, who was the rector of Trinity Church, and he was somebody who was interested in having communion every Sunday. That's not something that the Bishop McIlvaine was happy about. Well, the vestry of Trinity Church issued an invitation to another clergy person to come and be their rector. But Bishop McIlvaine wanted Mr. Perry to be the rector, to actually be the deacon in charge, because that's what he was. And the vestry at Trinity Church said no, they weren't going to walk back their invitation. So what did Bishop McIlvaine do? He approached some members of Trinity who were not happy, and some members of Grace Church who were not happy about the high church leanings of those congregations, and he convinced them to form a new congregation which would decidedly belong to the evangelical low branch of the Episcopal Church. And on October 26, 1846, 45 men representing families from both of those congregations met at the American House Hotel in Cleveland to sign articles of association with the Episcopal Church under the name St. Paul's. St. Paul's first church building was started in 1846, and it was almost finished. It was within 10 days of being complete when on August 3rd, 1847, it burned to the ground. The entire city rallied around the fledgling congregation. People in the parish who had already coughed up a lot of money for pew rent, coughed up a lot more money, and even the Baptists and the Presbyterians in Cleveland gave $800, $600 for another church building to be built. At this time, they built the church out of stone, and it was the second first building of St. Paul's, which was finished in 1851, just in time for Bishop McIlvaine to hold the diocesan convention in the 55-foot by 120-foot brick building. These are two photographs that we have of the first building of St. Paul's. I like to point these out because this carte de vista on the left was the earlier of the two pictures taken. You can see by the time this photograph was taken, they had added spires to the bell tower, and they had added spires down down there. It's a very Gothic, but also a very high church architecture for a congregation that was supposed to be a low church evangelical. But there it is. That's what we have. I'm going to walk back now and tell you a little bit more again about how we raised money for the operating budget of the congregations back then. It was done by what was called pew rent. We didn't have the pledge system in place. We had pew rent. And so you would pay a premium for your pew. Let's just use the term $4,000. And then you would rent that pew from the congregation for a specific amount of money each year. In this case, these two folks, O.A. Brooks and B. Northup, rented their pews for about $450 a year. These little blue documents are legally binding documents in which once you owned that pew, even though you were paying rent on it, you actually owned it. And when you died, you could will it to your successor, your children and your children's children, as long as they were willing and able to keep the pew rent up, as long as they were willing to pay the $450 a year. So here is a pew rent chart from the original St. Paul's. This one is from 1852. This one is from 1857. And you can see right here is O.A. Brooks's pew. And over here, by the time he gets to 1857, he actually owns 2 pews, which is pretty amazing. The idea was the more money you paid, the closer to the front you sat. The less money you paid, the closer to the back you sat. And each church had what were called a few free pews in the back for people to come to church who didn't own pews or didn't have pews. I want to tell you that the pew rent system was a very hotly debated, hotly contested way of raising money for the Episcopal Church all throughout the 19th century. And when Trinity Church became the cathedral parish, it was done on the premise that the rector of Trinity Church wanted all the pews to be free, and they were going to adopt missionary giving, pledging, rather than half pew. So I'm ecstatic that St. Paul's has examples of not only pew rents, but pew rent charts to kind of help us understand how budgets were handled back then. This is Mr. Claxon and Mr. Paddock, and I'm looking for a book that I can't find. There is a wonderful red book that was written by Washington Jarvis for the history of St. Paul's in 1968. It was done at the invitation of Bishop Burroughs and Bishop Burt, who were asking congregations to update their history. And in this little booklet, which I can't believe, jumps out of the picture for a moment. Here it is right here. There are multiple copies of this in the parish office. And I know that Gail and Susan would love for you to have one so that you can study up on the history of St. Paul's. Washington Jarvis did that book. He did a very fine job. He actually based it on a previous history of St. Paul's that was typewritten but never published, and I'll get to that in just a minute. So I commend Mr. Claxon and Mr. Paddock to you in this book, because we're going to stop for a few minutes on the story of Julius Rylance, who was the 4th rector between 1863 and 1867. Last summer, a year ago, Jeannie Leinbach and I received some correspondence from a gentleman named Kenneth McGowan, who lived in Kent in the United Kingdom. He was researching his maternal great-great-uncle, the Reverend Julius Rylance. Julius Rylance, 4th rector of St. Paul's, and his arrival here at St. Paul's is the stuff of which historians and genealogists revel. Mr. Rylance was ordained in Winchester Cathedral in 1863, and the preacher at that service was none other than Charles Pettit McIlvaine, 2nd Bishop of Ohio. Now, what was Bishop McIlvaine of Ohio doing in England in 1863? Well, let me tell you. President Abraham Lincoln sent him to England to deal with the fallout from a little debacle known as the Trent Affair. Bishop McIlvaine's task was to try to change the British government's attitude and foreign policy from the Confederate South to the North. And it was there that he met Mr. Rylance, who also shared the good bishop's interest in the abolition of slavery. By 1864, Mr. Rylance was in Ohio. And by 1865, the Convention Journal for Ohio lists him as the rector of St. Paul's Church. By 1867, he is no longer on the rolls of Ohio, and in 1869, he becomes the rector of St. James Parish in Chicago, Illinois, which is just a few short years shy of being destroyed by the Chicago fire. And there seems to be something of a little mystery surrounding Mr. Rylance's removal from the city of Cleveland. We don't know much about that. It may just be semantics. The fact that he was removed meant that he was taken off the roster. But thanks to this typewritten history by Lyda F. Perkins, who was secretary of to the rector of St. Paul's in the early 1900s, we have photographs of all of these rectors, because she took the pictures that were owned by the congregation at the time and she glued them into her typewritten manuscript. She made 3 copies of the book. St. Paul's owns 2, and one of the copies is up at the Diocese of Ohio. But a lot of the photographs of the early photographs of the church we have because of Lyda Perkins' good work. So I need to take a step back now and introduce you to Gregory Bedell, who was the third Bishop of Ohio. He was elected in 1859 at the request of Bishop McIlvaine, who was frankly getting a little tired of traveling all around the state of Ohio on his own. And so what happened is that Bishop Bedell set up housekeeping in Gambier, Ohio, and Bishop McIlvaine set up housekeeping in Cincinnati, Ohio, and they divided the state up between themselves. He was the assisting bishop from 1859 until 1873. And in 1873, the good Bishop McIlvaine died while he was convalescing on the French Riviera. I will tell you another thing that I love to share is that both Bishop McIlvaine and Bishop Bedell spent months, and in one case, years out of the state of Ohio convalescing because of the stress of the job. They went over to Europe. It was a very popular thing to do, to go off to Europe for 3, 4, 6 months, and in one case, a year and a half, and just leave the diocese so you could recuperate your health to come back and have at it again. And so this is what happened. Bishop McIlvaine was there, and he died. He was brought back to Ohio by way of Westminster Abbey in England, his body, and at Westminster Abbey, oh horror of horrors, his casket was put on display with candles on it, a very high church thing to do, which Bishop McIlvaine would have clearly spun in his grave had he known they were going to do that. He was brought back to Ohio, and he's buried in Cincinnati as well. So that brings you up to where our bishops are, and that also brings us to the next rector of St. Paul's, the fifth rector of St. Paul's, who is Frederick Brooks, the younger brother of the Reverend Phillips Brooks, who could preach with such speed that it is often said Phillips could preach a 2-hour sermon in 45 minutes. In the wider church, Phillips Brooks is perhaps best known because of he served as rector of Trinity Church in Copley Square in Massachusetts, and the musicians among us will know that in addition to being known for his preaching and his brief Episcopal oversight, he was also eventually elected Bishop of Massachusetts. He's remembered for being the author of the beloved Christmas hymn, O Little Town of Bethlehem. More important to us is his younger brother, his little brother, Frederick, who became the rector here at the age of 25 in 1867. And I want to read to you from Jarvis's book about Frederick Brooks' first Sunday, okay? The arrival of a new minister in town was a great event, and even his parents came from Boston to hear his first sermon. The church was crowded to capacity. But Brooks, on having left Des Moines, Iowa, had given all of his vestments to the poor. So he was wearing an ill-clad, ill-fitting preaching gown, which was too long and too big for him. And when he was ascending the steps to preach his sermon, he tripped on the ground and he broke his eyeglasses, without which he could not read a word. And he was forced to blunder through his sermon as best as he could by memory. Well, the papers of the day report that the people were greatly disappointed. And Brooks was mortified, and he went to his room and sat there for the rest of the day, refusing to meet anyone. But let me tell you, the rest of his tenure as rector was not according to this beginning. He was what we would call a mover and a shaker, and he is responsible, his evangelical efforts are responsible for giving birth to several new congregations, which I'll mention in just a minute. Between 1860 and 1870, the population of Cleveland doubled, and the residential neighborhoods moved further east. The first St. Paul's building sat at the corner of East 4th Street and Euclid Avenue. And Brooks was attempting to get the church to move east along with the population, but it met with enough opposition that the idea was tabled, except that it wasn't, really. In 1871, Brooks compelled several St. Paul's parish members at their own financial risk to purchase property at Euclid and East 40th Street. A Sunday school began meeting there under the name Emmanuel Chapel. Then in 1874, the vestry of St. Paul's arranged for Emmanuel Chapel to move to Euclid and East 89th Street, where it would eventually become Emmanuel Parish. And everything was set for the church to build a new building at Euclid and East 40th. Brooks could not have been happier. But tragedy struck when on a trip back east, Brooks mysteriously fell off of a railway trestle and was drowned. The entire vestry of St. Paul's went to Boston for the funeral, and Brooks's big brother Phillips came to St. Paul's, Cleveland, the next year to preach 3 memorial sermons, and then he published a volume of his brother's sermons, which we are very fortunate to have in our parish archives. This is a memorial altar that was set up for a reading of the burial office for Phillips Brooks that was done at Plymouth Chapel. This is where the membership at St. Paul's was meeting because they had already sold their building at East 4th and Euclid, and they were waiting for the new building to be built on Euclid and 40th Street. And so they set up a memorial altar, which they used to read the burial office for those folks who couldn't go to Boston. This is his gravestone in Boston, and you can see very clearly it says that he was the rector of St. Paul's Church, Cleveland, Ohio, and he was only 32 years of age when he died. This is the painting of Frederick Brooks that we have, which now resides in the Brooks Room in the current St. Paul's Church. So here's the original St. Paul's in 1865, and here is the new St. Paul's that was originally drawn up in 1870. And this building was completed in 1876, just in time for Christmas Eve services. It was designed by Gordon Lloyd of Detroit. It was a Victorian Gothic building, and it was faced with Berealed sandstone. It could seat 1,000 people, and it was situated right in the center of the fashionable Millionaires Row. And here's where I pause to tell you that St. Paul's gave birth to several congregations due to the missionary work of Frederick Brooks and his successors. These include Grace Church South, which was founded in 1869, Emmanuel Church, which was founded in 1876, St. Philip the Apostle, which was founded in 1894, and Christ Church, which is now Christ Church Shaker Heights, which was founded in 1909. You can see that this is an amazing Victorian architect, and this is a photograph of the building and a postcard that was done right after the building was finished. I want to point out to you that in the photograph there is a little boy standing at the corner. This is something that photographers did to give you a sense of human scale. They would often put, when they were photographing buildings, they would often put a live person in front of it so you can look at. But if you look at the postcard on which this is based, you can see their little boy is standing right there as well. So they used this photograph in order to print this postcard when the second St. Paul's was a brand new building. This is the interior of the second St. Paul's as it was originally in 1876, and then as it was renovated towards the late 19th century. Again, I have to tell you as a church historian, this is pretty high church stuff. This is pretty high church architecture for an evangelically low church congregation, but beautiful nonetheless. This is the way that St. Paul's looked when Walter Breed became the rector. And I want to point out to you that this altar right here is the altar that we now have in St. Martin's Chapel. That is the altar that we have in St. Martin's Chapel. So you can look at it the next time we're able to be in the church. So Bishop Adele, by the time of 1889, having been the bishop from 1873 until 1889, called for a successor. He was tired, he was old. By that time, the Diocese of Ohio was split into 2 dioceses, and the northern 44 counties retained the name Diocese of Ohio, and the lower counties became the Diocese of Southern Ohio. And even so, by 1889, he was really interested in having a new bishop. So his health wasn't the best. He was spending more and more time out of the diocese. And in 1888, in March of 1888, there was a special convention that was held at Trinity Cleveland. And the Reverend Dr. William F. Nichols, who was the rector of Trinity Church in Hartford, Connecticut, was elected to be the next bishop. He was elected by the clergy at the convention, but that election was not ratified by the laity. And because Bishop Bedell opposed Mr. Nichols' election by the clergy, he withdrew his request for an assistant. Almost immediately after he did that, Bishop Bedell's physicians informed the standing committee that he was permanently disabled for the discharge of his official duties. And the next day, the convention then proceeded to elect the Reverend Dr. Henry Yates Satterlee of New York. And at that point, Bishop and Mrs. Bedell headed off to Europe. However, Mr. Satterlee declined to accept the office to which he had been elected, stating that his sense of duty was really to his church, Calvary Church in New York. I want to point out that later he would be elected first Bishop of Washington, D.C., and that is an invitation that he would accept. So on June 12th, 1888, at the annual convention of the diocese at Grace Church in Sandusky, Bishop Bedell sent a short telegram from Switzerland where he was convalescing, urging the convention to take up again the election of an assistant bishop. Once again, the name of William F. Nichols, rector of Trinity Church, New Hartford, was placed in nomination, and once again, he was elected, but this time, both by the clergy and by the laity present. However, he also declined to be the Bishop of Ohio, and later he was elected second Bishop of California, again an invitation which he accepted. So there was a special convention meeting in St. Paul's Church, Cleveland, on November 1st, 1888, and the Reverend Dr. George Williamson Smith, who was president of Trinity College, was elected by both orders, lay and clergy, on the first ballot. Now, he gave careful consideration to the call. He even visited the diocese, but he too declined the offer to become bishop. Well, May 15th, 1889, Trinity Church, Toledo. Bishop Bedell sends a telegram from Paris, where he's convalescing, and he prays fervently that God will give the diocese just the bishop it needed. Now, some say that prayer may have been really that he wanted the diocese to have just the bishop it deserved. But what's recorded is just the bishop it needed. And that prayer was abundantly granted. The Reverend Dr. William A. Leonard, a youngish rector of St. John's Church in Lafayette Square, Washington, D.C., was elected by both orders on the first ballot, and Dr. Leonard accepted the call, finding it the plain will and direction of the Holy Ghost. He was 41 years of age when he was consecrated assistant bishop of Ohio at St. Thomas Church in New York on October 12, 1889, and 4 days later, Bishop Bedell resigned as diocesan bishop, and Bishop Leonard, who had only been assistant bishop for 4 days, became the fourth Bishop of Ohio. Now, October 31st, 1889, Bishop Leonard wants to meet with the clergy of the diocese and as many laymen as he could, but there's only one place in the entire city of Cleveland that's large enough to host that gathering, and that is St. Paul's, Cleveland. And so they met together for a day in 1889 on October 31st, and here he is, having had a photograph of himself taken with the clergy of the diocese at that time. So this is Bishop Leonard right here in the middle, wearing his rochet and shamir, and here are all the rest of the clergy. And if this picture were bigger, I could point out a few people to you. It's really a treasure of a photograph to have, because again, shows us what the front of St. Paul's, Cleveland looked like in 1889. So we next have Nelson Rulson, who's the rector between 1876 and 1884, and then Cyrus Bates. And Mr. Rulson, I want you to remember, because he is the first clergy person from St. Paul's who would eventually be elected a bishop. And he was elected bishop of what was called the Diocese of central Pennsylvania, which is now the Diocese of Bethlehem. But Cyrus Bates, poor Cyrus Bates, he was not only a priest, he was also a lawyer. And so because of that, Bishop Leonard, he didn't do him any favors, but he asked him to do something that was an extremely difficult job. And in order to tell you that story, I have to go and tell you a little bit about this fella, Howard McCreary. Howard McCreary was the rector of St. Paul's, Canton. And in 1890, Howard McCreary published a little book called The Evolution of Man and Christianity. And this little volume immediately raised a storm of controversy. The chapter which gave the most events was one on miracles, in which he took a different view. The two most controversial stances was that he put in print and he preached from the pulpit that he didn't believe in the virgin birth of Jesus and he didn't believe in the bodily resurrection of our Lord. Well, Bishop Leonard, in May and June of 1890, having been bishop for almost a year, sent McCreary formal admonitions insisting that he submit to Leonard's episcopal authority and that he cease from expressing his peculiar views. The Reverend Mr. McCreary refused to make a promise. And this is a part of what comes from Bishop Leonard's journal, where he says that he is forbidding his preaching his peculiar and erroneous views in this diocese. Because he refused, there was an ecclesiastical trial, a heresy trial, which was held at Trinity Church in Cleveland on January 7th and 8th, 1891. Now, this is the cathedral parish. This is Trinity Church as it was on Superior Street. Not quite the cathedral that we know of on East 22nd and Euclid. And the trial was held here in the church itself. The court consisted of 5 judges: the Reverends Yelvington Morgan, Dean of the Cathedral Parish, the Reverend Harold Aves, who was the rector of St. John's Church, Cleveland, the Reverend Albert Putnam, who was the rector of Emmanuel Parish in Cleveland, the Reverend William H. Gallagher, rector of St. James Church, Painesville, and my hero, the Reverend George Franklin Smythe, who was by that time the rector at St. Paul's, Toledo. The Honorable George T. Chapman, a lawyer and lay member of St. John's Church, acted as chairman and legal advisor to the court. And the prosecutor was none other than the Reverend Dr. Cyrus Bates, rector of St. Paul's, Cleveland. McCreary defended himself, but he was assisted by the Honorable Judge Jesse Harlan. The trial lasted 2 days. It caused quite a sensational stir in the newspapers around the country, and it made Mr. McCreary a conspicuous figure in the theological world. The New York Times reported that an observer at the trial could not help feeling that the Reverend Mr. Cyrus Bates wished the duty of prosecutor had fallen to someone else. Although it was a trial without bitterness, the 5 members of the court were not especially equipped for the task, but they would be expected to settle McCreary's fate and also put the Diocese of Ohio on record on theological questions that were being debated the world over. Additionally, it would indirectly commit the Protestant Episcopal Church to a fixed position, this in a church which had long boasted of latitude of belief within its boundaries. The Cleveland Plain Dealer was more direct in its commentary. The more the matter is examined, the author writes, the stronger will be the conviction in the minds of the dispassionate thinkers that the prosecution of Mr. McCreary was ill-advised. Well, after 2.5 months of deliberation, the non-Cleveland clergy, Gallagher and Smythe, voted to acquit, and the Cleveland clergy, Aves, Morgan, and Putnam, voted that he should be suspended from his ministry for 6 months, and if during that time he did not recant his views and promised not to teach or publish on them, he should further be deposed from the ministry of the Episcopal Church. The division in the court created as much comment as the trial, and the verdict was generally said to settle nothing. On March 18th, Bishop Leonard pronounced his sentence upon McCreary, and on March 19th, McCreary immediately resigned his parish in Canton. Now, McCreary was advised that the sentence pronounced on him was uncanonical, in that it imposed 2 penalties for 1 offense. He therefore moved the bishop on September 1st to restore him to the ministry of the Episcopal Church, but Bishop Leonard had his own set of advisors and he availed himself of a technicality to change the sentence from a definite suspension to an indefinite suspension. McCreary almost took the thing to the civil courts, but on September 22nd, he renounced his ministry, which the bishop formally recognized on September 25th, and that was because he was elected pastor of the Universalist Church of Saginaw, Michigan, which is where he went off to. Well, poor Cyrus Bates. This was a real thorn in his side, but he got through it and was a very successful rector at St. Paul's. In 1890, Bishop Leonard's just the bishop. The McCreary trial is just heating up, and the rector of Trinity Church handed the keys of his church to the bishop, and Trinity became the cathedral congregation. In 1874, at the time that Frederick Brooks was buying land at Euclid and East 40th Streets, Samuel and Philip Mather of Trinity Church purchased a lot at Euclid and East 22nd Street. In 1899, the cathedral broke ground, and in 1907, Trinity Church was consecrated. Also in 1907, the Reverend Dr. Walter Breed was called to be the 10th rector of St. Paul's. And this is what he inherited. What he inherited was the fact that there were 3 Episcopal churches on Euclid Avenue: the Cathedral Parish at East 22nd Street, St. Paul's at East 40th, and Emmanuel Church at East 89th Street. Now, this was before transportation was anything but mass, and soon it became apparent to Dr. Breed that members of St. Paul's were leaving Millionaires Row and moving east into a new developing residential area called the Heights. But there were already 2 other Episcopal churches on the Heights, St. Albans and St. Martin's. And parish boundaries were much more fixed at this point in our diocesan history. This was before you would drive past 2 or 3 Episcopal churches to get to the one that they wanted to call their spiritual home. From 1912 until 1917, Dr. Breed was not only the rector of St. Paul's Church, but also the rector of St. Albans in Cleveland Heights. And after that, in 1923, St. Paul's purchased property at the corner of Fairmont Boulevard and Coventry with the intent of building a new church. So we're going to take another step back, and we're going to look at what else is going on in the diocese at this time. 1918, it's the centenary of the diocese. World War I is coming to an end, and pertinent to what our situation right now, we have the 1918 Spanish influenza pandemic. And from October until November 11th, in Ohio and other places around the country, there were no church services. They were known as churchless Sundays. And what we know about what went on in Ohio comes from Bishop Leonard's journals. And I will give this to you as a way of saying that when Church Life comes out, our diocesan magazine comes out in the summer, there are going to be a series of essays from people all across our diocese in which they talk about how they're finding God during this pandemic and during this time of being separated from their congregations. But I've also written a historical piece, which is how the diocese responded to the pandemic of Spanish influenza in 1918. So I commend that to you as you receive it. If you're not on the list for getting the Church Life, please send me an email, and I will make sure that Church Life is being sent to you. I have the ability to get Jessica Roca, who's the editor, to add people to the roster. So if you're not getting Church Life, let me know. I'll make sure that you get it. So also something that's happening in this time is that Bishop Leonard decides in 1914 that he wants an assisting bishop. He's getting old, and he wants somebody to assist him. And who we get is a fellow by the name of Frank de Moulin, who had been the rector of Trinity Cathedral, but was elected in 1914 to be the bishop coadjutor of Ohio. He was the bishop coadjutor from 1914 until 1924. And in 1924, he realized Bishop Leonard was never going to retire. So he'd been 10 years bishop coadjutor, waiting to become the Bishop of Ohio, and he realized it wasn't going to happen. So he resigned on the idea that he was not in good health. He went to Baltimore, became the rector of a very large congregation there, and he lived until 1947. What happened in 1925 is the diocese elected Warren Lincoln Rogers, who was the dean of the cathedral in Detroit, Michigan, to become the Bishop of Ohio. In 1925, the convention of our diocese welcomed the newly consecrated Bishop Coadjutor, fresh from his consecration at the cathedral in Detroit, Michigan. He hopped on a boat, and on the morning of May 12th, he hopped off the ferry into Cleveland. And then he was taken to Trinity Cathedral, where the convention warmly received him. However, prior to the start of that convention, the delegates of St. Albans Parish was circulating a brochure objecting to St. Paul's plans to build a church in Cleveland Heights. And the brochure shows a clear boundary violation, that this is the boundary for St. Albans, and here's the corner of Fairmont and Coventry where St. Paul's is going to build. Well, what ensued next, what ensued next is recorded one way in the Diocesan Journal and another way by the Cleveland Press. How it's recorded in the Convention Journal was, according to resolution adopted yesterday, the appeal by the vestry of St. Paul's Parish on the protest of St. Albans Parish was discussed at length. How it was recorded in the press is, conciliation fails again as St. Albans' protest against St. Paul's relocation is debated for seven hours. Good Lord have mercy. 7 hours. Well, no good solution came out of this convention. But at the end of the day came an adoption of a new section of Section 35 to Canon 11, which would forever bar the resumption of an argument on the floor for any future convention. And it vested Bishop Leonard with the power to decide the whole thing by acting by and with the advice of the Diocesan Council. And before the 1926 convention, an amendment to the Rules of Order called for the creation of a committee on the dispatch of business. Nobody wanted to be taken by surprise again for anything like this. And basically what Bishop Leonard did was he threw this in Bishop Rogers' lap. In the 1926 convention, Bishop Leonard addressed the convention saying, "My first convention with you did not prove all that our beloved bishop wished for me upon my introduction to the diocese. You will recall that we had a rather delicate situation in discussing boundaries of parishes. More than once it looked as though much mischief and bitterness might issue out of the Cleveland Heights proposal. There are some consoling factors, however, including a sincere desire for all to arrive at a happy solution. We have not yet solved the difficulty, and we seem to have accomplished little, yet it is nothing to have fostered a good spirit, a spirit of goodwill and mutual friendliness, though we differ widely on methods and means. There are many angles to the problem, many vexing questions that will cause infinite delay. We must maintain a spirit of goodwill. We must think of the future as much as for the present." And then he addressed the 1927 convention saying, "We look forward to the day when other parishes and missions may be able to realize their dreams, as in the case of St. Paul's Cleveland, when its new project becomes a reality." And finally, in 1928, he addresses the convention and says, "St. Paul's Cleveland has built the first unit of its magnificent property in Cleveland Heights, and the same was dedicated by Bishop Leonard." By this time, St. Martin's had merged with St. Paul's and negotiated for the sale of their old building, but services were still being held at St. Martin's, and services were also being held at the old St. Paul's until the new building could be put up. Now, in truth, St. Albans, St. Martin's, and St. Paul's all had plans to build edifices to the glory of God, none of which materialized. Even St. Paul's plans were scaled back. Here's the architectural drawing of what St. Paul's Cleveland Heights was going to look like. And you can tell from the drawing that that's a much taller ceiling than we have right now. This was the original plan for St. Martin's. This was the plan for St. Albans that was being touted back in 1925. What Bishop Rogers reported on in the 1928 convention didn't progress much further due to the Great Depression and World War I. Now, why do I share this story with you? Because history is a prologue to the future. And that includes the stories that we would prefer not to hear, or the stories we would prefer were redacted another way. All stories are somewhat subjective, but less so if we learn from them. And since the birth of St. Paul's Parish, and indeed since that stormy convention almost 100 years ago, much has happened in the life of the church. And the ministry of the church is reconciliation. That's the ministry of the laity, the ministry of the priesthood, the deacons, the diaconate, and the episcopacy as well. Before St. Albans could celebrate their 100th anniversary, a tragic fire, ruled to be arson, destroyed much of the nave and the sanctuary on June 4th, 1989. And then with the good wishes of the bishop, the canon to the ordinary, Jeannie Leimbach, I was able to convince folks that we needed to take that baptismal font from St. Albans, which has now been closed. The new building that they built has been closed. The congregation has disbanded. Some members of St. Albans have come to St. Paul's, and I said, we really need to get the baptismal font and we need to bring it to St. Paul's, and it sits in the Chapel of the Cross, as I hope a reminder of the folks from St. Albans that they have a home at St. Paul's too, that some of their history has become part of our history as well. This is a photograph that was taken of the congregation of St. Paul's in 1930. You can see that what is built is the bell tower and the church, which is now Tucker Hall. The design for the new building came from the Cleveland firm of Walker and Weeks. It was begun at the corner of Fairmont and Coventry in 1927. The parish hall was erected in 1927 and 28, and a 125-foot tower was erected in 1929. And then, and so this is what the parish looked like prior to the addition put up in 1947. So in 1949, rather, in 1949 to 1951, the rest of St. Paul's was built. This adaptation is English Gothic architecture. The building has been twice enlarged since 1951. There was a preschool wing that was added in the 1950s, and a 6,000 square foot south wing that was completed in 1991 and renamed the Nicholson B. White Gallery in 2013 in honor of St. Paul's rector, Nick White. In addition, St. Paul's renovated and remodeled the parish hall and named it Tucker Hall in 1983 in honor of the Right Reverend Beverly Tucker, Bishop of Ohio in the 1930s and 40s. So here we are at the dedication of the new St. Paul's on Fairmont Boulevard, and it's 1951. And I want to draw your attention to this gentleman in the middle. This is Edward Thomas Demby, who was born in a wagon en route to Baltimore from Wilmington, Delaware on February 13, 1869. He was confirmed in the Episcopal Church by the Right Reverend John Spalding of Colorado. Demby was for the rest of his life known as a high churchman drawn to the liturgical reforms and orthodox theology of the Oxford movement. He was ordained a deacon in 1893 and a priest in 1895. In 1902, he married Antoinette Marietta Bricks. Her parents, by the way, were members of Christ Church in Oberlin, and she was the first African-American registered nurse in Cleveland. From the time of their marriage onward, they considered themselves to be a ministry team. In 1917, the Diocese of Arkansas elected Demby to be suffragan bishop for colored work in Arkansas and the province of the Southwest. Now, I will tell you that the province of the Southwest was Arkansas, Texas, Kansas, Oklahoma, Missouri, and New Mexico. That was his stomping ground from 1917 on. He was consecrated by Presiding Bishop Tuttle at All Saints Church in St. Louis, Missouri, on the Feast of St. Michael and All Angels, September 29th, 1918. And he was the 296th bishop in the American succession. Bishop Demby retired in 1939 at the age of 70, and after 26 years of Episcopal ministry, it was a ministry that was abounding in joy, but also fraught with struggle for racial equality in the Episcopal Church. The Dembys moved back to Cleveland in 1943, where Bishop Demby was first on the staff of St. Andrew's Church in Cleveland, and later assisted Bishops Beverly Tucker and Nelson Burroughs. Only in 1946, 28 years after his consecration, suffragan bishops were given the right to vote at General Convention. Mrs. Demby died in early 1957. Bishop Demby died on October 14, 1957, and was buried from Trinity Cathedral. The service, as he stipulated, was very high, and nothing of a biographical nature was said. Although nothing about his death appeared in our diocesan magazine, Church Life, and there was only a very small obituary in the Cleveland Press, Bishop Burroughs acknowledged his life and work at the Diocesan Convention in 1958. The Dembys were buried in unmarked graves at Lakeside Cemetery in Cleveland. But on May 17, 1992, they received a headstone monument designed by Demby's own hand, which was discovered by Wilma Ruth Combs, the president of the Ohio chapter of the Union of Black Episcopalians, along with diocesan archivist Don Shepard. The monument was paid for by Episcopal bishops of African descent, and our own Bishop Williams, Arthur Williams Jr., officiated at the dedication of the grave marker. Here's the way St. Paul's looked in 1961 before the renovation that was done during Alan Gates's time. You can see that the choir and organ are hidden behind a choir screen. We have W. Chave McCracken, who's elected rector in 1964, having served as rector of Christ Church Oberlin and St. Peter's Lakewood in Ohio. And the reason why I like to bring Chave up is that he is responsible for this event happening in St. Paul's. On May 14, 1963, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke to a capacity crowd inside St. Paul's Church. Now, I will tell you that Dr. King was invited to speak at other churches in the area, but never inside the building. He was allowed to preach from the front steps. He was allowed to preach from the parking lot, but he was never allowed to preach in the building until Chave McCracken and the vestry at St. Paul's invited him to come into St. Paul's. So it was a very historic event. Here's Chave sitting here, and the picture doesn't show it, but Bishop Tucker is sitting in the other chair. Again, a photograph of the nave and sanctuary. About 1980, again, prior to the renovation work done during Alan Gates's tenure. And some of you know this guy, right? This is none other than our beloved Carl Parker, who became the organist and choir master in 1979, celebrated his 40th anniversary as our rector, or as our organist and choir director in 2019. It's been an incredible and amazing career, and I can't tell you how much joy I've gotten from getting to work with Carl over the last several months. So, Alan Gates became the rector of St. Paul's in 2004. He was the rector here until 2014, when he was elected Bishop of Massachusetts. And here he is on his consecration day with the Bishop of Massachusetts and our own bearded Bishop Mark Hollingsworth at the time. It was a happy day for the church. He's been the Bishop of Massachusetts ever since. And of course, Jeannie has been the rector of our parish since September 2015. So she's got a 5-year anniversary coming up here pretty quick. Well, I think I undoubtedly have gone over. I have, and I apologize for that. You don't even get to play Stump the Priest, but if anybody has any questions that I might be able to answer, I'd be happy to take a few questions at this point. Don't forget to unmute if you're going to ask a question.
Reverend Brian, there are a few questions in the
Sure.
chat. I asked 2 of them. Do you want to want me to tell you, or do you want to look in
Yes,
the chat?
because I'm not able to see them in the chat if you put them.
Oh, okay. So I had asked, was the pew rent, was that in lieu of tithing, or was it in addition to tithing?
That was in lieu of tithing. That was the way
Okay.
churches raised money back then, was pew rent.
The next question from Eileen Beal, was the destruction of the first church arson? Given the divisiveness at the time, it makes sense.
So what was reported in the paper was that it was a suspicious fire, and it very likely could have been arson. The Cleveland Press at the time reports that people saw some folks around there at dusk, and then they smelled a gasoline or petrol or some kind of kerosene or something, and then by midnight the church was in flames. So it's very likely that it was arson. We didn't have the technology back then to actually figure that out. So, but what's even more amazing about that story is the way the rest of the Christian churches in town came to the aid and really helped St. Paul's build its first building out of stone. Thank you, Rebecca.
And then I asked, in what year did McQuarrie publish his book?
1890.
1890.
Mm-hmm.
And then Eileen also wrote, she says, wow, so much of this seems to be about church politics, hardly what people join the church for.
Yes, indeed. I mean, it's, to me, it's a miracle. We're going to celebrate Pentecost on Sunday. And to me, the church exists solely because of the Holy Spirit. So if it were left to us, we would have ruined it long ago. To quote Martin Luther, the Lutheran protege, we would have ruined it long ago. But there's a fair amount of politics that are involved, and sometimes the intention for the good, and sometimes good has come out of it. I think that we have to look again at history with a bit of a grain of salt, and we have to be able to be honest about some of the stuff that was happening back then that allows us to be where we are today. So thank you. Other questions? Well, if there are no questions, I will tell you that this will be up online for you to look at again if you'd like to. If I said something way too quick and you didn't quite catch it, you can look at it. I'll have it up in the next week or so for you to be able to do that. And I'm going to end with an extemporaneous prayer, something which I don't do very much because I am a big fan of the prayer book, but I didn't find a prayer for us to use to close, so I'm going to pray extemporaneously. So mindful that God is with us wherever we are, let us pray. Gracious and generous God, the giver of every good gift, including the gift of the church, including the gift of the Episcopal Church, and including the gift of St. Paul's community. We thank you that you have given us such a goodly heritage. It is a gift and a treasure which you have given to us to carry on into the future. And we invite your Holy Spirit as we prepare to celebrate Pentecost. We invite your Holy Spirit to be present with us always in our endeavor to be the church in the community and around the community. Thank you for each person who has joined this series to learn a little bit more about the church and about St. Paul's and about the diocese. I ask you to empower us to do the work you give us to do and the ministry you give us to do in this parish community. We give you thanks for Jeannie, our rector, and for Jesse, our assistant rector, and for the lay persons who step up to leadership roles time and time again on the vestry and other places. All of this we offer up in your most holy name. Amen. All right, friends, thank you so much. And it's been a pleasure. And I will hopefully be talking and seeing you soon.
Yes.
Take care now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you.